So this is kind of a follow-up video to my last video on how to sound design wet sci-fi sounds. And the last video was very specific on using Ableton's stock vocoder. So for those who aren't using Ableton, I kind of try to get a sound with a similar texture in Vital. And my starting point for this was to look for a waveform that has an interesting warbly texture at a very low pitch. And the one I really like for this is this one. But obviously others will probably give you a similar result. And you can also import your own wavetables or create your own ones and just play around with the available ones as well. So this is what it sounds like at a normal pitch. And at a really low pitch, it sounds like this. So I kind of like how it sounds at the very bottom here. So I'm already gonna put an LFO on this and just automate this very small section down here. Reduce the tempo a bit for this so that we just have this very subtle movement in there. And now one of the main things to push this sound forward is to use one of these modes here. And what I have found is that the bend mode works really well for this. I'm just going to use the same LFO, and I primarily like the sound of this in the range between like 50 and 100%, so I'm going to keep the automation range in this section here. And then you can also add one of the spectral morph modes here. You can use the vocode function, which sounds quite interesting. And what works also really well is this spectral filter down here. And by using this, we get a lot of volume fluctuations. So I would probably use a compressor afterwards. Maybe also even just set the attack here to 100% just to even the sound out. Maybe you want to modulate this with a macro knob, or you could also just use an LFO. It doesn't really matter. Just depends on how flexible you want to be with this. And for this one, again, I don't really like anything below roughly 30 to 40%. So let's just reduce the range of the macro knob. So another thing is the pitch that you might want to modulate. And we can just use another LFO for this, or we can also just use our macro knob. So maybe just set the macro knob to the global voice transpose and then give this a bit of range. You can also set this to go into both directions. And this is gonna depend on the wavetable you're using, but a lot of those, when you pitch them really low, they become quite noisy. So I probably wouldn't go much lower than this. And to make this a bit more wet sounding and also give it some width, you can just use a chorus at a very low percentage. And something that can also work quite well for this type of sound is delay. And as you can see, I'm also making sure that the compressor is also last in this chain because it's going to accentuate all the effects that we are using in front of it. And so with the delay, maybe you want to go with something like a ping pong delay. And you can also increase all the effects once again with just using something like OTT afterwards. So if you're not using Ableton, you can just use the free version of the plugin by Xfer. And you can also just play around with the pitch and see if you can find a sweet spot for this. And to give this sound a bit more movement, it can also be interesting to just use a filter at the end of this chain and put an LFO on the cutoff here. And then you can either just draw in, random shapes, or you can start with something like this nervous groove preset, which is just going to give you a bunch of random curves essentially. And you can also set this to seconds and then just control this with an LFO or maybe even with your macro knob as well. Let's just put the macro knob on the frequency here. And you can also push just everything up with more compression. Yeah, and pretty much just see which timings you will like the most and also play around with the different waveforms that you have. And of course, using different modes here and here are just gonna give you a bit of different results, but I think for this kind of sound, the bend works the best from what I've tried at least. And obviously, if you have other types of glitchy effects maybe that you can add in this chain afterwards, then just play around with those and see how they affect the sound. But I think this is a nice basic setup to experiment and play around with and just develop the sound more into this wet sci-fi direction.